Dr. David Vocadlo is a professor at Simon Fraser University and also a co-founder and chief scientific officer of Alectos Therapeutics. David completed his PhD at the University of British Columbia in 2002. Following postdoctoral studies in chemical biology at the University of California, Berkeley, he joined the Department of Chemistry at Simon Fraser University in 2004. He is now a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Department of Molecular Biology and Biochemistry. He leads a laboratory for chemical glycobiology, which focuses on developing new glycomics tools to better understand the roles of glycoconjugates in health and disease. Based on research from his lab, David co-founded Alectos Therapeutics, a pharmaceutical company that develops strategies to address medical conditions for which there are no effective treatments. Over the years, the company has advanced a potential treatment for neurodegenerative diseases to first in human phase 1 clinical trials. David has received several awards and is the author of over 100 scientific publications and patents. Next up, we have Dr. Stephanie White. She has over 20 years of experience in patent portfolio development and IP counseling, where she is skilled in integrating IP strategy with business strategy. According to Stephanie, the most exciting part of her job is working with mentors and entrepreneurs to help them leverage their technology advances to really make a difference. She is keenly aware that IP is among a company's most critical assets, and especially in the case of early stage companies, it is essential these companies are provided with the proper support to allow them to grow, manage, and benefit from their IP portfolio. Stephanie's practice concentrates on the protection of chemical and biochemical technologies in various industrial sectors, including clean tech, chemical manufacturing, pharmaceutical, medical devices, life sciences, oil and gas, and alternative energy. She completed her PhD in clinical chemistry from the University of Windsor, and she is currently a partner at Kirby IP Canada. We also have Dr. Kaylee Wilson as part of our panel today, and she is the Director of Business Development at Quark Venture, a Vancouver-based venture capital group that invests globally in health science. At Quark Venture, she is responsible for identifying and performing due diligence on potential investment opportunities. Previously, she was the CEO of ARTMS Products, a company specializing in technology that produces medical isotopes for diagnosing cancer and cardiac conditions. Prior to joining Quark Venture in 2016, she was Associate Director of Partnerships at the Center for Drug Research and Development. She obtained her PhD at the University of British Columbia, where she worked in close collaboration with senior scientists at INEX Pharmaceuticals on the vaccine potential of lipid encapsulated nucleic acid. Those are our three panelists today. Pretty excited to hear from them. We will open up the questions now, and with that, I'll pass it over to Will.
Let's just start off with a question to everyone. What is your advice to those looking to pursue a career like yours? Where do they start?
You know, in terms of starting off, I guess it really stems from a desire to kind of pursue an entrepreneurial line of research, really, and an interest in seeing things translate to having some utility or benefit for society. And I guess for myself, I never really had thought about that until I became an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. And it was a number of things that triggered me to start thinking about that. But at the root of it, I guess you have to feel comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, if you know what I mean, because, you know, the whole process of entrepreneurialism involves ups and downs. There are inevitably setbacks and advances. And in the end, you kind of set out, I guess, like a boat or a ship into the ocean, and you know, you go up and down with the waves, and you don't necessarily know where you're going to end up in terms of what port, but you just have to persevere. And so I think really you have to really want it. You have to be willing to persevere and face setbacks and pick yourself up again. And you can't really get hung up on, you know, one idea. You have to be open to kind of reorienting what you're doing and thinking about opportunities as they arise. You know, I guess it's the analogy of, you know, you don't necessarily catch you can't catch a fish by pushing on a line. You have to pull the line essentially. So you have to make sure that you've got a really good technology that you're allocating and investing a huge amount of time into. And in the end, that technology, at the end of it, there's someone who is really going to want that technology. And then finally, you got to make sure that you find people who are really excellent and great and trustworthy to work with, because, you know, you may be incredibly energetic and smart, but there's an enormous amount of stuff you need to learn. And so you have to be comfortable learning new things and trusting in other people and taking advice from other people as well. And finally, I guess I would say, you know, you definitely need good professional expertise. I think, you know, Stephanie here on the panel will tell you the same thing. And I can certainly support that. You really want excellent professionals supporting you in terms of intellectual property, because that's a cornerstone, but also other things like material transfer agreements and all legal aspects and licenses as well. Those are all really key things. So I think being really open to ideas at the root of it and being comfortable with kind of just going out there and searching and thinking about opportunities and pursuing them and recognizing you're going to face setbacks. I guess that's in summary.
So as a patent agent, I started my career as a researcher, as do a lot of patent agents. And while I was working on my research, we started working on something that was patentable. And I got exposed to the patent industry that way. And it was exciting. It was something that made me think about my research in a different way. And that's when I decided to pursue the career. And now in terms of what I wish I knew before I went into that career, I wish I knew I'd be spending so much time sitting in front of a computer, typing and writing and writing and writing and more writing. But certainly it's an interesting career. It's one that allows you to learn a lot about different areas of science. You can't be somebody who's focused on just one area of expertise. You have to sort of, revel in your generalist experiences and enjoy learning about new different areas of technology. You also have to be a person who can multitask, can very quickly assimilate new technologies and then try and work with the inventor or the company, depending on what the situation is, to see how you could protect their new technology in a way that really supports the company in moving ahead with their commercialization and or investment plans. It's, what Ryan said about me enjoying most in my job dealing with new inventors and small companies as they develop new technologies. It's true, because that's the exciting time. Everybody's excited about their research. Everything's working the way they want it to work. And I just want to make sure that that feeling continues on by giving them the right foundation and working with them to provide a useful patent, one that's not just a piece of paper, but one that they can actually build from, develop the rest of their portfolio, use in their discussions with investors like Kaylee, and also use as they start to develop a plan for their product.
For me, I have always been very passionate about science, but I realized even in my undergraduate degree, when I was doing some co-op placements at different types of industries, that I really liked the application of science, or I really enjoyed the translation of science. And so from a very early stage, even in my education, when I was looking to do my PhD, I tried to find an academic investigator who would take me on, who was entrepreneurial. And so I ended up at the University of British Columbia with a professor named Dr. Peter Cullis, who has started quite a number of companies in the Vancouver area and have had a lot of success. And so, right from the beginning, he was very open to exposing me to that translational environment and helping me build my network outside of just the academic network. And I moved very quickly from academia towards the business side. So when I finished my PhD, I did not do a postdoc. I also did not go on and do an MBA like a lot of my other counterparts did. But I entered directly into a into a role that was with the Center for Drug Research and Development at a time when it was just starting. And it was really a good opportunity for me, because it was like starting or joining a startup where there was a lot of things that needed to be done and there wasn't enough people. And so I feel that if you're someone who is trying to get exposure to different opportunities and just different areas, startups are a good place to do that, because there's always the opportunity to put up your hand and take on an additional role, because there's always too much to be done. And I ended up being at CDRD for just over 8 years. And really over that time, spent most of my time as a scout, so out in the academic community, looking for interesting, innovative scientific discoveries, and then thinking about the therapeutic and commercial potential of those, and trying to help find funding for those, trying to help find industry partnerships, or in some instances, we would spin them out into new companies. And when I left CDRD, I joined Quark just over 3 years ago, and in a similar role now, although looking for interesting, innovative companies that we can invest in, and I guess handing out the money versus when I was at CDRD was always asking for the money. But then I've also had the opportunity to take on the CEO role with Artemis, which was one of our portfolio companies, and I was there for 1.5 years while we built the company up from seed stage to the point where we could recruit a full-time CEO. And we actually just last week announced that we closed a $19 million US Series A for that company. And I've just taken on another interim CEO role with a bladder cancer company. And so I think for me, it's just always been the transitions that I've been able to make in my career have primarily been through my network and people that I have met in my network and people that I've worked with in my network and that are willing to basically give me a chance to do something that I haven't done before. And I think that's been really valuable in my career.
Yeah, we have a specific question from Matt to Stephanie. So I'll just ask that, and then I'll ask a question for everyone again after. Most graduate students don't get much experience learning about or working with IP in our courses. This makes it difficult for us to review IP concerns like material transfer agreements. When we do start collaborating with a group that requires this, are there resources you can point that could help early researchers to better understand IP?
Certainly, there are resources online. The Canadian Patent Office itself has a website that has some resources available for inventors to look at. That tells you a little bit more just about patenting. The other places you can look are just online websites. Law firm websites often have information about material transfer agreements, NDAs, and so forth. But really the best way to do it, I think, if you can do it, if you can manage it, is to talk to someone. And most law firms, most IP firms will give you some time for free. So this shouldn't be something that they would charge you for. You can talk to them for an hour and a half, whatever. If you need more, that's fine too. And they'll give you sort of the IP 101 on what these agreements look like, what specific clauses you might want to consider, at least from an IP perspective. I'm not talking about the rest of the agreement, just from the IP clauses. So the other thing is, I do know that a lot of grad schools these days are starting to include some IP teaching in their courses. It may just be a seminar or two, but these are often very focused and very particular on the types of things that researchers will need to understand before they start in a sort of corporate or commercial type of environment. And I encourage you to take advantage of as many of those types of courses as you can.
Okay, great. So I'll start with David for this. At what point in your career did you know your idea or your client's ideas were worth being protected and commercialized? Like, was it from your PhD postdoc? And how did you retroactively protect it?
Well, thanks, Will, for the question. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, you know, I think I wasn't really interested in commercialization of anything until I started as an assistant professor. And, you know, I was much more of the kind of ivory tower and intellectual pursuits frame of mind during my my bachelor's and PhD and even postdoc. And it was really only when I was an assistant professor when we started working in this area in which, you know, there weren't a lot of people working in it. It was interesting. And I had a visit from Masad Dama, who came from McGill to give a seminar. And he's an entrepreneur, and he works on antisense oligonucleotides and synthesis of monosaccharide analogs, and he's done a lot of really nice work. And so, you know, I was talking to him and telling him about some of these inhibitors that we've been generating, and he said, "Oh, you know, you should think about patenting those. They have pretty good properties, you know, in terms of their potencies, etc." And you know, it's a new area, and I, you know, at the time, I didn't really think much of it, but I guess that was the seed that ultimately germinated into what became Alectos Therapeutics. Because, you know, even though at that time I didn't think that there was much potential utility, because the field generally thought that inhibitors of this enzyme that, you know, would be toxic and would basically kill off animals. And so I just kind of put that aside. And then, you know, Matt McCauley, who was a graduate student in the lab doing his PhD, he's now a faculty member at University of Alberta. You know, really, well, he's obviously a, you know, incredibly smart guy. And he had been doing these studies using these compounds in mice, and we'd been looking to see if inhibiting the enzyme would induce insulin resistance and cause changes in glucose homeostasis, like the leading hypothesis in the field. And Matt, you know, he tried incredibly hard to see any defects in glucose metabolism and glucose homeostasis. And you know, he was never really able to do that. And at that point, I think I realized, oh, well, this is actually a druggable target. And so we patented the work, essentially, the inhibitors. But the key event actually was work done by another graduate student, Scott Yuzwa, also a really talented researcher. He's a faculty member at University of Toronto now. And I remember distinctly the day he came in and he pulls out this image of this immunoblot in which he's been looking at tau phosphorylation in rodent models. And he showed actually that using these OGA inhibitors that increase gluconac levels actually antagonizes phosphorylation of some key pathological sites. And I thought, oh, geez, that's superb. So we had a little drink and celebrated. And at that point, we realized we might have something that was really valuable. And so he went on with another graduate student, Xiaoyang Shan, who's gone into industry, does a lot of really nice work, and carried out these transgenic tauopathy studies to show that these inhibitors actually would protect against tauopathy in transgenic models of Alzheimer's disease, at least the tau component of that. So then we kind of really knew that there was something that was useful. And it was, you know, the whole process was quite a tough road because we were doing new things all the time. And so, it was great to work with a superb team of researchers because they were able to pull off a lot of tricky studies without any backstop in terms of deep lab expertise in some of these methods. But at that point, we kind of felt that we really had something.
I think the key question there is usually when somebody comes to me, they've already decided that it's worth protecting, it's worth commercializing anyway. So the analysis to decide whether or not the technology is commercializable is not usually done in my office, although I might have comments. Typically, what I need to do is then determine whether or not, even if it has value out there, has it been done before? Is this something that I can help them protect? Because I think one of the key steps that you have to make while you're deciding to commercialize something is to make sure that you've got the freedom to do that without infringing somebody else's IP, and while also giving yourself the opportunity to protect your own IP, to carve out your own little niche. And that's where I come in. In order for something to be patentable and thereby protectable, it has to be new, can't have been done by somebody else before, it has to be non-obvious. And those are the two areas where I tend to focus, especially with researchers out of universities who are in the publish or perish type of environment. And there's the ongoing impetus to try and get everything published quickly. And sometimes that's where they shot themselves in the foot. And I try to work with researchers to avoid that. So the overall question in this this webinar is what do I wish I knew? What do I wish all researchers knew is don't publish before you come to see me. Publish after I tell you it's okay. So let's make sure that you have something filed as a patent application before you go and talk to a potential investor or show it at a conference or publish it in a journal. Anyway, the other thing is when I look at the patent application preparation process, I work very closely with the inventors and also when I can, with the business people to make sure that the claims in the patent are in alignment with what they want to do for the commercialization of the product. And for those of you in the audience that don't know, the claims of a patent are what define the scope of protection that's afforded by the patent. And the claims are just a series of one-sentence clauses at the end of a patent that define very specifically what your invention is. And that's where we'll spend a lot of time working in making sure that the language is very carefully and very succinctly describing your invention in a way that we can exclude others from doing it. I also think this is a question that Kaylee would have a lot to say about.
So we typically invest in companies that are a little bit later stage in that they've already been seeded by another group. So we typically come in Series A or later, but we do some seed investing. And the reason why I'm clarifying that is because typically when we're looking at investing in a company, they already have IP that has been filed, typically not granted, but filed. And the exception to that would be some of the health IT companies that we invest in where it's more algorithm based and they often don't file IP on those approaches. But for us, it's very important to understand the potential for that company to obtain the IP that they have filed on. And so we work very closely with groups like Stephanie's, and we actually hire law firms at the beginning during our diligence to do a full assessment of the IP for us and give us their opinion on which claims they think have the potential to be granted. But more importantly, start to work with us and the company to understand what is the IP strategy going to be moving forward. How are we going to continue to innovate and how are we going to continue to protect that? And it's also very important from our perspective, even before making that investment, to know that we are investing in a team of people in the company who are going to be able to innovate around potential challenges in the future with filing IP, and that we're also working with a firm like Stephanie's that also is going to be able to help us kind of stay on track and always ask the right questions from an IP perspective. And so we want to have that comfort very early, but it's never, well, at least from my perspective, with respect to intellectual property, it's never binary. There's always a lot of gray zones that you're not really sure about until you have the patent granted. And so again, it's making sure that we're working with people that we think we're going to be able to come up with solutions with.
Great. Actually, Kaylee, I think you just answered a couple of these questions, but I'll just
okay.
mention them. Lisa would like to know how much data do you need to approach someone about IP protection? And then, well, I think you answered a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think Stephanie could definitely answer that as well. But I think going back to my CDRD days, I think the earlier that you can start to engage with your tech transfer office or with someone like Stephanie, you may not have enough data to file at that point in time, but they'll provide you with guidance on what additional data you need in order to be able to file.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, often I talk to people when they have very, very early stage proof of concept type of results, in vitro results, and maybe even only one that looks very exciting. The one that David mentioned, going out for a drink for, it might not have been enough to go and file a patent application at that stage. But when you work with the patent agent, they'll look at what you have and then look at what the patent offices currently are looking for in terms of the sufficiency of disclosure. is the term they'll use. And you can work with your patent agent to map out almost what the next sort of experiments need to be. And when you're thinking about the type of data that's required for a patent application versus a publication, it's actually quite different. In a patent application, you want to try and have at least some level of data that covers your invention as broadly as possible. So it's not like in a publication where it's peer reviewed and you'll find that you have very deep data for a very specific point. That's not really what a patent agent is going to ask you to do. A patent agent is going to say, try this alternative, try that alternative. If you're looking at a chemical structure, for example, you have all kinds of substituents that are marked by R groups. I don't want R1 just to be methyl. I want it to be any alkyl or alkenyl or something like that. And I want you to test as many of those as possible, as an example. To the extent that you can, it's better to have some data that is in animals when you're talking about a pharmaceutical or a druggable target, anything like that. Because the patent offices around the world, they vary somewhat in what level of proof is required, but more often than not these days, they're looking for some in vivo results, even if it's just one, and then you've got a lot of in vitro data as well to support it. If you have some in vivo results, then it's a good time to patent.
Kaylee, I had another question for you. You said that you were a scout for interesting technologies. What are some traits you consider interesting and investment-worthy technologies? Could you give us some examples?
Yeah, for us, it's really, particularly at Quark, we're not looking for me too or follow-on opportunities. We're looking for things that we think are very innovative and are going to be disruptive. And so in that space, it's very hard to define what it is before you see it, because we often, it's more sort of that aha moment when someone brings you something and you think, wow, that's brilliant. And often it's actually something that when you think back is simple, but you would have never imagined that it would be true. And then the other piece of it that's really important for us, again, is that core team of founders, which are typically scientists, but they may have already started to attract some more business type folks that are passionate about the innovation and the technology, and that are going to be able to, again, think through the challenges as they arise. Because, I mean, even though we come in typically a Series A or later in the therapeutic space, that's usually still a preclinical asset. And so there are going to be a lot of challenges that you're going to encounter. And so again, it's, I don't know how to define it. It's just when we see it, we kind of know.
How do you evaluate something that improves a patent that already exists?
So one, you already understand then with that question that not just new things are patentable, improvements are patentable. In order for something to be patentable as an improvement, it has to be a non-obvious improvement, something that actually makes a substantial difference in whatever it is that you're trying to improve. Say it's a process, you want to have a substantial difference in yield or in reducing the number of steps, something like that. You need to have something that's not just a workshop improvement, not just, I don't know, just a very simple improvement is not going to be enough. It also has to be a non-obvious improvement. So when I talked before about the criteria that we use for patentability, you also have to consider whether or not you're having some sort of advantage by your improvement, but also whether or not somebody would have automatically done that. So if you've got a list of alternatives, would it have been an obvious alternative to use that different solvent or to use that different substituent? If so, it may still be patentable, but only if you get a surprising result as a result of that change. If you don't get a huge improvement, you have to really then focus on whether or not the change you made was as a result of a non-obvious alternative. That's more or less as simple as it is. And unfortunately, obviousness is not a straightforward consideration. It's something that is very fact-based, so it's very specific to the type of invention that you're looking at, and it's also very reliant on what the field looks like, the technical field looks like at the time that you're making the determination as to whether or not something's an obvious or non-obvious improvement.
Stephanie, I actually have another question for you. It's regarding publish or perish. Mm-hmm. Some research discoveries tend to be competitive and time sensitive. It occurred that the patent process was slower than other competitors published their results on similar discoveries. Could you comment on that?
So I know there's always a race. There's a race to patent. There can also be a race to publish, so that you don't get scooped by another group, for example. Having said that, if it's a very important technology, it's one where there's a lot of people working on it, and there is this race, then it's probably more likely than not something that's also worth taking the time and protecting. You do want to, I mean, Kaylee mentioned working with people that you trust, people that you can rely on. You do want to have a good relationship with a patent agent that you can work with to maybe get something quick on file if you're close to publication and you want to rush to publish something. You just have to be very careful that when you file something quickly, and even if you do use that, it's a phrase I hate using, but it's one that you hear all the time, file a quick and dirty provisional application to get something on file. You're going to have to go back and make sure that you fill in the blanks. Quick and dirty provisionals can be put on file, which essentially look like a manuscript that you're submitting, or even a presentation that you're giving at a conference, but it doesn't really look like a good patent application yet. You can do that if you really, really have to publish, but then go back and very quickly thereafter fill in the blanks to make sure that you meet all the sufficiency of disclosure requirements that Patent Office is going to want to have. But the advice I can give you is the sooner you can talk to a patent agent when you're talking about a technology that you think is important, the better.
So we'll just go back to a question for everyone. We'll start at David. What skills did you learn or wish you had learned during your grad studies that helped you through your career path?
I think, well, the main thing that I learned was to focus analytically on quality of science and the strength of experimental results, and also to really recognize the limitations of results as well, and to be self-critical. And in the end, I think those skills are actually really important and will serve you well in whatever you do in the future. I think, again, coming back to this point, I think it was Stephanie who brought up the idea of being a generalist to some extent. And I think if you're thinking about entrepreneurialism, then being a generalist to some extent is necessary, because you have to wear different hats and so forth. And so recognizing that your knowledge has limits, particularly in fields that are outside of your direct expertise, is really important. And then the ability to listen to advice from experts, whilst also recognizing that people give you advice that's based on their own experiences. So it's based on sort of the lens of their own experience of the world. And so you have to listen to advice and take the good advice and sift out what's going to really work for you. I think all of those are skills that you learn largely during the course of a PhD in graduate school, actually. But then you just have to apply them to different situations.
I agree.
I suppose to add one thing, I think that thinking about having some familiarity about intellectual property is actually really important. And then also the need for material transfers agreements, et cetera, to protect intellectual property is really important. I think we've talked a reasonable amount about the IP, but the MTAs as well that function to protect intellectual property earlier on are quite important as well. And I've had some experiences there, which are kind of funny.
In terms of what I learned during grad school and what I wish I'd learned, I think what I wish everybody else would learn in grad school is a little bit about IP. It would make my life easier. And also, one comment I do have about things like MTAs and NDAs. So an MTA is a material transfer agreement. For those of you in the audience that don't know, it's an agreement that you would put in place in a situation where you're giving a piece of material, so a chemical or a cell culture or something like that, to a third party to test and to evaluate. But you want to do it under certain conditions, and those conditions are typically one of some non-disclosure, and also you want to include in there things like no reverse engineering, so that if they have something in their hands, the third party has something in their hands that's yours, you don't want them to try and figure out what the components are in some situations, if it's a composition, for example. An NDA is a non-disclosure agreement, typically, and those are in place where you're just telling someone about your technology, but not actually exchanging any material for evaluation. In either case, one of the things that people sometimes forget is that these agreements are only as good as the parties to the agreement. And if you enter into discussions or exchange IP with somebody and you don't trust them, or you don't know them that well even, you probably want to try and have a patent on file before you enter into those agreements and move ahead. Having said that, they can be incredibly valuable in certain situations. Just know who you're getting into agreements with. So sorry, I took a side from the question there a little bit. In terms of what I wish I knew, or what I learned in grad school that's helped me in this career, perseverance. As you know, research isn't always a success. So we have our good times and bad times during research, and also in our real lives after school, there's times when you really have to persevere at something and work hard at it. Learning good writing skills are important in grad school. That's going to take you far, no matter what field you go into, whether it's research or IP. And good communication skills. I think those are things that you want to develop during time in grad school as well.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, particularly to Stephanie's last point, I think it is one of the things that I learned in grad school that I wasn't anticipating was important as it actually is the ability to communicate your scientific findings or your research to a variety of different audiences, and being able to tailor how you're communicating that depending on the audience, and then also even more importantly, if it's verbal or face-to-face, being able to pick up on cues that perhaps people aren't understanding what you're trying to communicate, and then changing your story or your approach to meet that. Because I think particularly began to learn that in grad school, but definitely during my time at CDRD, and now at Quark, where we have people approaching us with these great ideas and trying to explain them to us. And sometimes at the beginning we just don't really understand what the technology is, and part of that's background, but part of that's the way that it's being communicated. And then the other piece, particularly at CDRD, we had stakeholders, obviously working very closely with academic investigators who had a deep knowledge of the technology, but then we're trying to communicate those opportunities to pharma, where it may be someone that was more of a generalist, we were to government, to foundations. And so I think those communication skills are incredibly important. I think the other thing for me that I guess I wish I had have known more about in my PhD is, although I was lucky that I did do my PhD in an entrepreneurs lab and did have an exposure to a pretty broad network of people, I didn't understand during my PhD the breadth of career opportunities that there are out there for PhDs that are not necessarily, in a lab or down a traditional scientific route. And I also didn't understand that often you're going to create your own opportunities for yourself. And I think that's something important to be aware of, and always trying to identify sort of where there are gaps, and then trying to take the skills that you have and kind of insert yourself into that gap and form a career for yourself.
Okay, great. We have a question for David. What do you do when you're in the process of patenting a discovery, but you also want to share your discovery in a scientific conference or discuss it with other researchers? So how much talking is too much? How much can you reveal? Could you give us some examples?
Yeah, I think Stephanie is really the best person to get to specifics here, but as she pointed out before, if you think you have something that's really quite valuable, then you want to ensure that you have protected it. And the best way of doing that is to file a provisional patent. And, as Stephanie pointed out, there's different, there are really solid provisionals, and then there are seat of the pants provisional patents as well. And so you kind of really just have to balance the importance of filing a patent based on what you believe the potential value of the technology is versus the importance of publication and how you feel those two are important to you personally, right? Because in the end, you have to do what you ultimately is going to satisfy your own personal interests, as well as, recognizing the needs of other team members as well, right? So I don't think there's a really clear answer, but Stephanie's probably much more able to talk specifically with regards to, how much talking is too much talking, because there are specific criteria and guidelines associated with that, or more recommendations anyway. I don't know, maybe Stephanie, if you'd be willing to talk about that.
Sure, I do have some suggestions here. I'm not naive enough to think that you're always going to be following my advice in filing provisional application before you talk to anybody. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you want to talk about your technology and you aren't able to file a patent application ahead of time, really focus on what the results look like in comparison to what's out there. So focus on, why your technology is better. What are you achieving with your technology, not how you're achieving it. Don't give the details of, for example, the ingredients of your composition, or the chemical structure of your new compound, or the steps in your process, for example, but talk about what the outcomes look like. And say, so, I'm getting an ID50 that is much more improved than what's currently on the market. Focus on that instead of on how something works. One of the things that I should have mentioned a few times, actually, based on some of these discussions, some of these questions is, and I don't know the makeup of the audience here, but most of them, I assume, are in universities. And there is a tech transfer office at every university, and these tech transfer offices have a lot of resources, and they also have people there who are willing to help you answer some of these questions in specific instances. So one of my recommendations is that you please take advantage of the resources available to you there.
Stephanie, have you ever had a client or encountered clients who've lost their IP because it was stolen or because it was not developed timely enough?
So I haven't actually had any clients who've had their IP stolen. Having said that, I've had quite a number of clients where I've had to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you anymore with this patent application because you've disclosed it or somebody else has disclosed it ahead of time. I've heard, of course, stories about people who've had their IP stolen through discussions, and this is one of the reasons why you want to have a good NDA or an MTA in place before you start sharing ideas with anybody. If you're actually going to be entering into a research collaboration with somebody, have a strong research collaboration agreement in place ahead of time. These are the sorts of things that you can use to help protect yourself going forward if somebody steals your IP. Unfortunately, your recourse in the courts is very limited because if somebody's in breach of one of these agreements by stealing your IP, you would have to then go to the court and explain to them that they're in breach. The court may agree, yes, they're in breach of the agreement, but what sort of damages can they assess? And if the technology is at a very early stage, the damages are almost impossible to assess at any large enough value to give you proper compensation. So I keep coming back to the same thing, patent early if you can.
Kaylee, could you share with us a story, perhaps where an investment into a product or technology did not meet the expectation of what you thought it would be?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Well, without giving away anything confidential, I mean, investing in life sciences and biotech is risky. And so it's anticipated that a large portion of those investments will either, not come to fruition or will maybe not meet expectations. I think we've had a number, so we've only been investing for just over 4 years now. And we have a relatively large portfolio. We've been quite aggressive, so we have 23 investments. And there have been a number of investments that we have had to stop. And primarily those were because technically they didn't work out. It was, you know, it was the science. We invested at a point where there was a hypothesis, and if we were able to prove that to be true, then we would have something great that we could take into people. And, you know, sometimes that happens preclinically, which is, you know, the earlier you're able to prove that something's not going to work, the cheaper you've done that, the less money you've spent. So ideally that happens preclinically, but in some cases it happens in the clinic, and I'm sure you see that it happens all the time. And so when investments, I mean, we never like to see an investment fail, but when an investment fails based on the science, it's much easier to take, at least for me personally, because that can be expected versus when they fail, you know, based on something else, like commercial or business.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a general question for everyone. I'll start with David. You've multiple roles to play in your job, i.e. managing a company, in the executive team, leading a research team, dealing with partners. What do you wish you knew before you embarked on the journey of a multifaceted career?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for myself, I really enjoy continued learning, and I think that's true of many people who are attracted to graduate school in general. And you learn a great number of diverse skills. I think Kaylee pointed out, you know, that finishing graduate school prepares you for a lot of different opportunities. I think that the skills you learn in graduate school is not just science, but many other skills, and those are incredibly important in many different areas. And so I suppose that, you know, I've always loved learning, and then you have to be comfortable with that whole process of lifelong learning. And you got to be comfortable not being an expert and continually assimilating new knowledge and listening to people, particularly experts. As I mentioned before, I think that's something that, you know, we've heard several times. And then at the end of it, I think it's really important to know yourself and what you actually find enjoyable and what you really want to pursue. So for myself, you know, I enjoy developing ideas and building things up. And the uncertainty of that whole process is actually somehow kind of really appealing. And, you know, feeling uncomfortable with things is actually something that internally I suppose I quite enjoy, because otherwise it kind of becomes boring. And not everyone is like that. And so you have to recognize your own inner interests and how you obtain personal fulfillment, and then kind of match your pursuits so that you are realizing that personal fulfillment, I think. And the earlier you do that, I think the easier it is to kind of direct the course of your professional development.
So when I finished grad school and when I sort of embarked on my new career, I thought, well, wait a minute, I must know everything. I got my PhD, I'm so smart. And I think one of the things I wish I knew was how much I would be a continual student. I'm always learning something new. I'm always having to admit that I have to learn something new. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a very good thing, and something that is valuable in the job that I'm in, because I have to learn new technologies all the time. What else? I wish I had focused a little bit more on my writing skills when I was younger. I'm a good writer now. I wasn't a good writer when I started this job. So I think, like I said before, you have to continue to develop your own expertise no matter what career you enter into, and don't think that it ends after you finish your PhD, that you've sort of done what you need to do. That's actually not the case. But it's what makes this job exciting.
Yeah, and I think for me, very much to add on that, I think, you know, I have definitely, just based on the different types of investments that we look at, we invest in anything health. So my background is more on the therapeutic side, but I diligence medical devices, I diligence health IT companies. And so it's really being able to be comfortable being a generalist and looking across those approaches and having a broad understanding, but at the same time having a good network of experts and we always bring in key opinion leaders in every company that we look at, and multiple key opinion leaders and get their opinion. So I think it's being able to really identify for yourself, like David said, what you're good at and what you like doing, and then building a team around yourself or being part of a team where the things that maybe you're not so good at or you don't enjoy as much are complemented by someone who that's their core strength or their core interest.
One last question for everyone. What advice do you have for those who want to pursue a career in the same field that you're in?
I guess, in some ways it circles around to the first question to some extent. I suppose that you have to really want it and be willing to work hard and face setbacks and bounce back from those setbacks. I think you have to have the expectation that there will be setbacks. It's almost guaranteed. You also have to really, you got to find the right people to work with. I think as Kaylee just said, you want to find people who have not just complementary expertise, but complementary temperaments as well in some ways, because, though people think in different ways, and recognizing that people think in different ways and have different skills by virtue of how they think is also really important. I suppose also that, starting and thinking about entrepreneurialism, it really stems from the idea of how you think about science and how you think about possibilities, needs, and opportunities. So I come back to this story where I mentioned, Masa Dama coming to visit at SFU from McGill. And I think he planted that seed of thinking about things in a different way. And the earlier you do that and you start to think about, possibilities, needs, and opportunities, you'll be better prepared for it in the end, and things will start to open up because you will see more than one thing that's possible to pursue. So following on from that, I guess I would say, don't get hung up on one idea. You got to think about the wider potential of a technology or set of technologies and think of the need. You don't want to push something that people don't actually need. You want to really make sure that there is a bona fide need that you're trying to fulfill. So I guess those are the key things. The key things are thinking about possibilities and opportunities, making sure you team up with really good people that you can trust who are complementary, and being able to listen to, and ensure that you get good advice from experts and professionals, with regards to legal matters.
For a career in the IP field, there's a few different options. You can work in an IP firm or a law firm. You can work in a tech transfer office. You can work in a company. But to become a patent agent, one of the things that you have to do is apprentice for 2 years. And you would have to do that, say, in a tech transfer office or in a law firm. And during that time, it's a really good time for you to determine whether or not this is something you like. As Kaylee said, it's important to find something that you enjoy and that plays to your strengths. And I guess my advice is take advantage of that, the need for the apprenticeship for the 2 years before you can sit the exams. And after you've done that, then you can sort of look back and say, okay, what did I enjoy about this? Where do I see myself doing this job? Is it going to be in an IP firm where I work for multiple different clients? Is it going to be in-house, which could ultimately become something like a chief IP officer or IP director? Or is it going to be in a tech transfer office where you combine your IP skills with your search for, you're working with new inventors and new technologies and moving them towards commercialization. So there's sort of different areas along the spectrum of commercialization that you can fit yourself into as an IP professional.
Yeah, I think on a whole, I mean, venture capital is not the easiest space to get into. You typically enter one of two ways. If you're, junior, you would enter as an analyst, and those folks can be individuals with PhDs or come more out of a sort of investment banking background. Or you often see serial entrepreneurs who have had a lot of success are then able to raise capital to then make investments themselves. But I think the advice I would give if you have an idea or you're an entrepreneur in the making is surround yourself with other entrepreneurs. Reach out to people in the community who have done it before, because they can give you a lot of advice on how they did it. But more importantly, if they're willing to share all of the things that they did wrong, it's very valuable, or all of the things they wish they had have done a different way. I think even in my role at Artemis and now with Sitka as CEO, really it's been the people that have kind of told me their war stories that's been very helpful. And then for, perhaps the students who are finishing up their studies and thinking about what they want to do and they're not sure, again, I'm a little bit biased, but I think if you're able to get into a startup and spend some time in a startup, it really gives you the opportunity to see all of the different roles that are available and actually take on some of those, just based on the need for for more hands.
I want to thank everybody for coming, David, Stephanie, Kaylee. So thank everybody again.